Hello, welcome to our Word on Fire Institute family, and welcome to all those of you joining us on YouTube. Welcome to Evangelization and Culture Live, our monthly 3-day live seminar on a topic at the crossroads of faith and culture. We are delighted to have in the studio with us today Dr. Christopher Kaczor, a professor here at the Word on Fire Institute, an acclaimed author, and a lecturer. Dr. Kaczor also leads our faith and reason community here at the Institute. He will give a 3-part lecture, Debunking Myths About Marriage. Day 1 is entitled, Why I Am Down on Shacking Up, Cohabitation as a Failed Alternative for Marriage. We're dual streaming today, a presentation on both on the Institute platform as well as on YouTube. For those of you viewing from the Institute platform, please open up the chat icon below the screen and introduce yourself. You who are joining us, let us know where you're joining us from as well. As we begin, please start typing in your questions and comments, which we'll be getting to in the second half of today's presentation. To those of you who are watching on YouTube, please also be encouraged to do the same. We want to invite everyone watching on YouTube to consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. I'll say more about that at the end. Without further ado, let's get to Dr. Christopher Kaczor on Debunking Myths About Marriage. Class is in session.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I've been teaching a course on the ethics of love and marriage since 1998, and it is a fun class to teach. I've taught classes in logic, and let me tell you, students do not bring as much energy when we're talking about logic as they do to the ethics of love and marriage. So it is a fantastic course to take, and I always start the semester the same way. I always say, this is the most important class you're ever going to take at the university. And I really believe that, because I think if you think about your life, one of the most important decisions a person can make is whether or not to get married. And if you choose to get married, who to get married to. Now, today, I'm going to give you the lecture that I think, of all the lectures in this Ethics of Love and Marriage course, it's the lecture where I find the students have the most transformation. I've had countless students talk to me and say, you know, I was thinking of living with my boyfriend or girlfriend before getting married, but now I've really changed my mind. And so I'm going to talk about cohabitation. And basically, I'll talk about cohabitation in from two different perspectives. So one perspective would be people that are thinking of cohabiting as an alternative to marriage. So you could call these people who say, look, marriage doesn't matter, right? Marriage is just a piece of paper. Marriage is just a ring ceremony. It doesn't really matter. On the other hand, there are other people who really care about marriage a lot. And they would say, you know, marriage is the most important thing in my life. I want to have a lifelong marriage. I want to be happy. And so I'm going to cohabit before getting married to really evaluate and see whether this person I'm thinking of getting married to is really going to be good for me in marriage. So in other words, the second group would think of cohabitation as a great preparation for marriage. So let's talk about both of these things. I'm going to be drawing here in particular on research done on cohabitation by Popenoe and Whitehead. And so, you know, one possibility is cohabitation as an alternative to marriage. And again, those would be people who say, look, marriage doesn't really matter to me. What I really care about is love. What I really care about is commitment. What I really care about is having a good, faithful marriage. Relationship. I want it to be harmonious. I want to really get along. And that's what I really care about. And so, interestingly, the other would be cohabitation as a preparation for marriage, right? The people that say, I want a really good marriage, and cohabitation is the best way to go about that. I'm going to say a little bit, too, about the relationship between cohabitation and children. And I'm also going to tackle this question. Does cohabitation affect men and women equally? Or are there some differences in terms of how it affects men and women? And then finally, I'll conclude with some remarks about why not get married. So first, cohabitation as an alternative to marriage. So these would be people who say, hey, I don't care about marriage. It's just a ring. It's just a ceremony. It's just a piece of paper. Love is going to flourish without all these legalities, without all these formalities. Love is going to flourish there. Now, it turns out that sociologists have studied cohabiting couples on the one hand and married couples on the other hand. And they've been doing this really for almost 50 years. And they've really come to some very strong conclusions that cohabitation is not like marriage in its effects. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is if you study, 100,000 people that are cohabiting together and 100,000 people that are married, what the sociologists find is very significant differences between these two groups. So how do they differ? How do, on average, cohabiting couples on the one hand and married couples on the other hand, how do these couples differ from one another? Well, they differ in a lot of ways. One of the ways is that if you compare these two groups, if you think about infidelity, are there some married couples that are unfaithful? Yeah, there are some, but the rates of infidelity for those that cohabit are much higher. If you think about domestic violence, do some married couples, do they have some domestic violence? Unfortunately, sometimes, but the rates of domestic violence are much higher for couples that cohabit. If you think about breaking up, what are the odds of your relationship lasting for your whole life? Well, if you are married, the odds of your relationship lasting for your whole life are higher in comparison to those that cohabit. They're much less likely to have a lifelong relationship. If you look at satisfaction in the relationship, what you find is that married couples on average report higher levels of satisfaction. They're more happy with their relationship. They're more happy with their partner. By contrast, couples that cohabit report lower levels of relationship satisfaction and lower levels of relationship or satisfaction with their partner. You also find among cohabiting couples more negative communication styles. So I'm thinking here about what Gottman would call the four horsemen of the apocalypse. It's when you are avoiding hard conversations, when you're speaking in a very harsh, negative, hypercritical way. These negative styles of communication are much more common in cohabitation in comparison to marriage. And then one final thing is that if you compare cohabiting couples on the one hand to married couples on the other hand, what you find is among cohabiting couples, much less support from the extended family. So if you think about, for instance, a married couple, well, maybe the parents will help the the married couple that has a new baby, and they'll get them a minivan or something, or maybe they'll help with babysitting, etc. And basically what you find is lower investment by extended family in couples that are cohabiting. And it kind of makes sense. If you think about a married couple, the in-laws think, hey, this is my son-in-law. So I really should treat him like a son-in-law, and I should really, invest in his well-being and the well-being of this relationship. Whereas in cohabitation, the person's not your son-in-law, the person's not your daughter-in-law. And so it makes sense in a way that you would treat them in a different way. They don't have that kind of status yet. So the bottom line is, if you think about your own relationship and you say, well, what I want in a relationship is I want to have fidelity, right? I don't want someone to cheat on me. I don't want any domestic violence. I don't want to break up. I don't want negative communication styles. I don't want my extended family not to support us. Well, if those are things you don't want, you're much wiser, given this research, going with marriage as opposed to cohabitation. In other words, it's not true that marriage is just a ring or just a slip of paper. It's actually true that there are significant differences on average between married couples on the one hand and cohabiting couples on the other hand. This is particularly true when we look at children. So if you look at children, the likelihood of a breakup of the parents of the children before the child turns 12 is 66% among cohabiting couples. Not all, but 66% is a very, very high percentage. What's the likelihood of a family breakup for children under 12 with a married couple? Only 25%. And we know from all kinds of sociological research that children fare best when they have their married biological parents raising them. They're much more likely to graduate from high school, much more likely to avoid trouble with the law, more likely to go to college, more likely to graduate from college, more likely to have good mental health as opposed to bad mental health. So in terms of the well-being of children, children really do flourish much more in a marital relationship in comparison to a cohabiting relationship. And sadly, if we think of child sexual abuse and child physical abuse, again, this is much more likely to happen in a cohabiting relationship, particularly if the cohabitation is done between, say, a mother and a guy who's not the biological father of the children in the family, right? That's a situation rife for potential abuse. So in terms of the well-being of children, both in terms of avoiding both physical and sexual abuse, you see again in marriage, much better outcomes for children. So what about cohabitation as a preparation for marriage? I think a lot of people think to themselves, I would love to be married. I'd love to have someone in my life that has unconditional love for me and someone in my life that I can have unconditional love for. I want to be married, I want to have kids, and I want to have one of those lifelong relationships where we can be grandparents together, maybe even great-grandparents together, and see our children and our children's children really flourishing. For some people, for many people who want to get married, this is really what they want, right? This is really their ideal. And so some people think, well, what I'll do to get that is I will live with my boyfriend or girlfriend before marriage, and I'll kind of test it out. And I'll be able to figure out whether this person is really going to be a good husband or a good wife. And so by means of this testing, I'm going to figure out whether or not I'm going to have, a good situation for an ideal, long-lasting, lifelong committed marriage. Well, the question that we can ask is this: will cohabitation, in fact, improve one's chances for a successful marriage? Is there any evidence that can answer this question? And in fact, there is a lot of evidence to answer this question. This question has been asked and answered by sociologists of marriage for the last about 50 years. And what they found is this: that although some believe that living together before marriage will lower their odds of divorce, in fact, there's no evidence that this is generally true, and a lot of evidence that it is not true. So studies vary as to, the degree to which they think cohabiting is linked to divorce, but some studies show an 80% higher likelihood of divorce if a couple live together prior to marriage. And so the bottom line is that when you compare married couples that cohabited together, if you limit it to married couples that did cohabit together on the one hand, for married couples that did not cohabit together, again, you find these big differences. And one of the most striking things in the research is that they found the longer a couple cohabits together, the higher the likelihood of divorce later. And this is sort of counterintuitive. You think, well, how could that work? I mean, if you live together with someone for 8 years, presumably pretty much, I'm guessing, all there is to know about them, how they live, where they put the toothbrush, whatever. All things that you would know. Are they messy? Are they not messy, etc. But it turns out that the longer a couple cohabits together, the more likely it is that they are going to get divorced. And there was a very high-profile case of this in recent memory of Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. So they lived together, if memory serves, 8 years. And then within a couple of years, they ended up getting divorced. And, people were surprised, but actually the research indicates that that's quite common. So you could liken cohabitation to, abusing drugs, right? It's never a good idea to abuse drugs for your health. But obviously, if you abuse drugs for a long time, 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, that's much worse than abusing drugs just for one summer or something, right? So the longer a couple cohabits, the higher the probability of divorce. Another thing that the researchers found was that especially detrimental was what's called multiple cohabitation. So what that means is, let's say I move in with one woman from age 22 to 24, and we break up. And most cohabiting couples do break up. So then I move in with somebody new, 26 to 28, and then we break up. And then I move in with somebody new, 30 to 32, and then we get married. So that would mean I would cohabited not just with one person, but with 3 people. So that couples that have multiple cohabitation have more than a 4 times higher likelihood of divorce than couples that didn't do that. This is a recent research from Stanford University. So multiple cohabitation is especially detrimental. The bottom line is this: if you want a relationship, a marriage that is lifelong, that's faithful, that has good communication, that is good for children, all this is much more likely to happen in a marriage which did not have cohabitation beforehand in comparison to a marriage that was preceded by cohabitation. In other words, there's no evidence at all that cohabiting prior to marriage is going to lower your likelihood of divorce or increase your likelihood of having a happy marriage. And again, many people think this myth, but it is a total myth. It's just not the case at all. Now, what about this question? Does cohabitation affect men and women equally? Now, in one way, cohabitation does affect men and women equally. So given the research I've said, if cohabiting with your future spouse raises your likelihood of divorce by 80%, well, if you're divorced, well, the effects are the same if you're a man divorced or a woman divorced. You're equally divorced. So in some respects, cohabitation is equal in terms of its effects on men and women. But in other respects, it's not equal. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about what men look for in a marriage partner, and on the other hand, what women look for in a marriage partner, you actually see important differences between those two groups. So what do men look for in a marriage partner? Well, both men and women alike want a marriage partner that's intelligent, right? There's no real significant difference between men and women on that score. And both men and women alike want a marriage partner who is friendly and nice. So no surprise there. That's equal really for both sexes. But there is one thing that men desire more in their marriage partners than women desire, and that is youth and beauty. So in other words, you'll get more men saying they care about the youth and beauty of their wife than you'll find wives caring about the youth and beauty of their husbands. And likewise, if you look at what women look for in a marriage partner, one way they differ from men is women tend to value economic productivity more than men do. In other words, if a woman sees a man who's really hardworking, who's producing, who's likely to be a very good provider in terms of being a husband, well, that increases the value of the man in her eyes. And men seem to be not as concerned about that. So you might think, well, look, isn't that just a focus of differences between genders based on, patriarchal oppression, right? So some people theorize that. The idea was that, well, yes, in patriarchal societies, you have, say, men valuing youth and beauty in their marriage partner, and women valuing more economic productivity. But if things change, that would change. But in fact, what they found is that is not the case. In a number of studies showed that these differences between males and females in countries like Norway, in countries like Sweden, that presumably have greater gender equality in comparison to countries like Afghanistan or Brazil or the United States, they found in these studies that these differences between men and women just didn't go away. In other words, even men in Sweden value youth and beauty in their marriage partner, and women in Sweden valued economic productivity in their marriage partner more. And so these differences just don't go away. So how does this lead to a certain inequality of the sexes? Well, think about the following scenario. Let's say you have a man who's 25 and a woman who's 25. They move in together and they live together, cohabit together for, let's say, 7 years. So now they're both 32. So what has happened over time? Well, the man has gained more of what most women are looking for in a marriage partner. So I think back to myself when I was 25, I was a graduate student at the University of Notre Dame, and I was making $10,000 a year. And at 32, I was already a professor. I was making, if memory serves, $39,000 a year. And so I was more eligible, you might say, I was married, but if I were single, I would have been more eligible to more women as a professor who's 32 than as a graduate student at 25. I was further ahead, as it were, in the marriage market. By contrast, a woman who's 25 who's now 32 has lost more of what most men value in the marriage market. So relative to where they began at 25, the man has gotten ahead and the woman has fallen behind in terms of the marriage market. So what this means is that marriage is systematically disadvantageous for women who are looking for a marriage partner. And so this is an important thing to remember, that it does, even though in some respects cohabitation affects men and women equally, in other respects, cohabitation does not affect men and women equally. So let's say you have, you're 25 years old and you're thinking about, getting married. There are some reasons people give for not getting married, even though they're of marriageable age. And one reason that people sometimes give is that they can't afford it. And it's certainly true that if you're 25 years old, let's say, just to pick a number out of a hat, you may not be able to afford a $100,000 wedding, a $200,000 wedding, etc. You can't have a big Kim Kardashian wedding. But what also needs to be factored in is not just not being able to afford a wedding, but what about being able to afford a divorce? If you think about divorce in terms of its economic effects, it has very, very serious economic effects. And there's other effects too, emotional effects from divorce, especially divorce with children. So if you're concerned about, economic well-being, it seems like the wisest thing would be to maximize the probability of having a lifelong successful marriage, because it is in fact lifelong successfully married people that on average do the best economically. So again, if you compare a married man, especially a married man with children, with single men or divorced men, etc., married men with children make significantly more. Why? Well, I know from my experience, when you're married and you've got kids, you really have this tremendous drive to produce, to provide for your wife and your kids. And so on average, married men with children make a lot more. So I think it's sort of short-sighted to say, well, a wedding's too expensive, so we won't, get married, we'll just live together. In fact, divorce is much more expensive, and getting married is not that expensive if you don't have a big lavish wedding. The second thing, though, is people say we're too young. And I do think, looking at the data, it is definitely possible to get married too young if you're 17, 18, 19 years old. The probability of divorce if you get married at 17 is extremely high. But what some people don't know is that, at least for men, there's no difference at all in the divorce rate for men if you look at a 22-year-old man versus a 29-year-old man. Exactly equal probability of divorce. And what many people don't know also is that the probability of divorce actually goes up if you get married after 32 years of age. You're more likely to divorce. Now, you're not as likely to divorce as you would have been if you got married at 17, but you're still more likely to divorce. So where's the Goldilocks age for marriage? Well, there is no single age for marriage, as if everyone should just get married automatically at this age. If you don't have the right person, you shouldn't get married at all, whether you're 22, 42, 52. But on average, the research indicates that couples that get married between the ages of 22 and 25, on average, have the most happy marriages. And again, I'm not saying just automatically get married to whoever you happen to date at 25 and without any questions. But on average, people of that age have the happiest marriages. So what does this mean? Well, what it does mean is if you find someone you really love, maybe in college, and you want to get married after college, you're 22, 23, 24 years old, you should not be afraid in terms of your likelihood of divorce to get married to this person. In fact, the odds are in your favor, not against you. So again, not to say everyone just automatically get married between 22 and 25, but people who are that age can feel very confident that they are not, quote unquote, too young. Yes, there is such a thing as being too young for marriage in our culture, 17, 16, but 22 to 25 is definitely not, quote unquote, too young. Other people say, well, we don't want to get married because I want to be my own person. And I've never really understood quite what this means, because when you're married, you still are your own person. I mean, you don't meld into this other person. And you can still have a great deal of freedom, in fact, a greater freedom in certain ways, to love. If you think about the goal of life as love, well, that is in a way enhanced in marriage. Anytime I want to find happiness through loving, I can just ask my wife, hey, is there any way I can help you? And I have an automatic and easy way to find happiness and love in my life with my spouse. Other people have a kind of travel narrative, and they think, well, I can't get married now because I want to travel. I have great news for you. You actually can travel when you're married. I've gone on many planes and I have a wedding ring on, and 0 times have they said, I'm sorry, sir. See, you have a wedding ring on. You can't get on this flight. No travel if you're married. My wife and I, we've traveled actually and lived all over the world. We lived in Europe for 2 different years, lived in Princeton for a year. This year we're at the University of Notre Dame for a year. We've lived all over the place. So you definitely can travel. You definitely can live in other countries, etc., while being married, and actually add something. It's really quite fun actually to see new places with your spouse and especially with your kids. And the final thing people sometimes say is, well, it's too soon to have children. Well, I have more good news for you. When you get married, there is no one who comes around and says, hey, now you need to have a kid right away. It just doesn't happen. Doesn't happen. So some married couples do have kids right away. Some don't, but it's still a free country. You know, there's no necessity for you to have a kid immediately if you get married. So in this presentation, what I've tried to do is talk about cohabitation. And I've talked about cohabitation as a preparation or as an alternative to marriage. People who say, look, I don't care about marriage. I just want love and a good relationship and a lasting relationship and no violence. But as we saw, the research indicates that all those things, all the bad things are more likely to happen within a cohabiting relationship in comparison to a married relationship. Now, other people have the idea that I really care about marriage, and so I'm going to cohabit as a kind of preparation for marriage. But as we saw, the research there indicates that cohabitation is not at all a good preparation for marriage. And in fact, the longer a couple cohabits, the higher their likelihood of divorce. So that's not really going to work well. We also talked about how cohabitation has different effects for men and women. So for women who are looking to get married, cohabitation puts them at a systematic disadvantage on the marriage market because most cohabiting couples don't get married, right? 80% don't get married. And so it puts them at a disadvantage on the marriage market when they come out of a cohabiting relationship. And then finally, we just talked about some reasons people who do cohabit or are thinking of cohabiting give for not getting married. But I think each of these reasons, if we think about it, aren't really great reasons for not getting married for the reasons that I just said. So thank you for your attention. I appreciate you tuning in today and look forward to hearing your questions. So please put in any questions you may have, and we'll be getting to those questions right about now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kaczor. This is very helpful. We have a number of questions regarding parents whose children are of the age or approaching the age to get married. And the question is, the cultural narrative that is put forward is very much seeing marriage as a capstone. You have to get your education first. You have to do all of these other things first. And then, once you have your house in order, as it were, then you can get married. How can parents practically have these conversations with their children who are approaching this age to help them to be open to this vision of marriage that you put forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that some people do think of marriage as a kind of capstone. They think, well, I want to get a master's degree, so I better not get married. I want to get a PhD, I better not get married. I want to become a professor, I better not get married. 2 things to say about that. One is that that really is also a myth. So I got married before I had my master's degree, before I got my PhD, before I became a professor. And in fact, I think being married helped me. Young people spend a lot of energy, at least young people who want to get married, kind of looking around for a partner and dating different people and trying things out and whatever. And if you're married, if you're a good person, you're not looking for somebody new, right? You're with your person. So I was able to get through graduate school, go from my BA to my PhD in just 4 years. And I really think part of that was being married because I was very focused. I was not worried about dating whatever. And, I just was focused on, my family and my work. And so I think it really actually helped me a lot to move forward. So I just think it's a kind of false narrative to think, well, if you're single, you're automatically going to be able to do better in your career. Again, the evidence shows very strongly that for men, at least, to be married with children is an enormous boost for their career, right? Why? Mm-hmm. Well, because married men with children typically are not staying out super late. They're not out with the boys drinking at 2 a.m. They show up for work, on time, sober, ready to do stuff, and they have a huge incentive because if they're a halfway decent person, they care about their family, and they are not working simply for themselves. They have this extra incentive, and they have an extra person to help them, right?
Yeah.
So the idea that, oh, this is just going to weigh you down, you'll never be able to move forward in life, you couldn't possibly do whatever, I think it's a myth. Again, the evidence shows that economically speaking, in terms of career, steps forward, to be a married person with children is definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a question too about what's the wider impact on the acceptance of cohabitation as far as society. So you've done a good job of showing, that marriage really makes more sense as opposed to cohabitation. But in terms of the knock-on effect across society, can you speak to that and why marriage is so important for the flourishing, not just of the individuals, not just the family, but of society as a whole?
Yeah, marriage is extremely advantageous for obviously the individual, for the society, for the family, and for the society as a whole. Part of the reason, I think, is that marriage involves this unconditional commitment to love. And at least in my view, a world with more unconditional love is a better world that is lacking that. And so you have in marriage something that on average is very good for men and very good for women. So if you look at things like wealth, both men and women do better when they're married. If you look at things like health, both men and women do better. If you look at the well-being of children, children do much better in raised by their married parents than in other family forms. And all this has very beneficial effects for society. So just to take one example, if you look at people that are incarcerated, there's a disproportionate number of people that are incarcerated that come from families that are not, married, biological family raising the kids. They come from single parent families, cohabiting families, etc., a much higher percentage. And that adversely affects all society. I mean, when you have crime rates going up, when you have violence going up, that affects the whole society very detrimentally. So I do think that marriage is something that is tremendously beneficial on multiple levels. Another way is in terms of education. Almost everyone recognizes it's helpful for all society to have a well-educated populace, right? If you go to the doctor, you want your doctor to be sharp, have all the medical facts at hand. If you go to a lawyer, you want the attorney to know the law backwards and forward. In whatever field you go to, right? If you get your car fixed, you want the person to be able to fix your car. So in general, we serve people through our intelligence, and our intelligence can be cultivated through education. And again, if you look at the well-being of students and how, who's graduated from high school and college, who's doing well, it's disproportionate that those students come from intact married parents. And so this really benefits not just the individual, not just the family, but even the wider society. So that's why it's incredibly important to think about these issues and really think through how to move forward in a positive way.
Yeah, no, that's good. Can you speak to, let's say we've got a couple who are currently cohabiting, and they're convinced by the arguments that you've put forward. What counsel would you give those folks as far as what are some next steps that they can take? How would they go about making a step in the right direction? Let's say they have children. I think the pressure that they're going to feel is this is going to be something that is a big commitment that they're making, but at the same time, how do they make that transition into the married state?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things about cohabitation is it turns out there are significant differences on average between men and women. So basically, women on average are more likely to look at cohabitation as a step towards marriage. So women on average think about cohabitation as kind of pre-engagement, like you're dating, and then you're seriously dating, then you move in together, and then you get engaged, and then you get married. And basically, men just don't think of it that way at all. They're not thinking about it as pre-engagement. So I think the first step is to have a real serious and good conversation, because I think sometimes you have these differing expectations, and in any relationship that can cause real problems, right? Even in friendships. I mean, if you have a friend and his expectation is that you go out together and play basketball once a month, your expectation is every week, well, you're going to have some conflicts. So I think getting clear about your expectations is really important. And then it could turn out if those expectations are made clear, and let's say in this case, which is more typical, the woman would like to get engaged, would like to get married, well, the sooner that conversation can happen, the sooner she can know, hey, I know my, cohabiting boyfriend, Frank, I thought this is what he wanted, but in fact, it turns out he really doesn't want this. Or maybe if they have that conversation, it turns out, yeah, Frank is, on board with that. But I do think having those conversations is really important, because you can have even years go by where basically one party has this expectation, this is pre-engagement, engagement's right around the corner, and the other person's not thinking that way at all. And as the years go by, this is really not ideal, because as I mentioned, the longer a couple cohabits, the higher the likelihood of divorce. So I think you want to limit the cohabitation as much as humanly possible.
Yeah, no, that's good. So we have a question. What are some practical resources that you might have for adults who are seeking a Catholic spouse? Maybe they've been in a cohabiting relationship, moved out of that, experienced some conversion. Now, how would they go about kind of essentially preparing themselves to enter into marriage?
Yeah. So I do think that whether you're married or not, to have a good life, to have a flourishing life, it's absolutely essential to try to develop more virtue. So what I mean by that is good habits that really allow a person to really love other people and to love God. So these would be habits like temperance. So using, eating and drinking in a moderate way, either not using alcohol at all or using it in a very moderate way. Habits like courage, habits like practical wisdom, habits like justice. So the more we can develop these inner resources, these habits that allow us to choose in a good way, to choose in a loving way, the better situated we'll be for either being married or being single. We'll be better situated to love other people, whatever our state in life. Now, that's true for everybody, and that's true really all the time. I mean, I'm married, but I still should try to develop virtue and move in this good direction. When people are looking for a marriage partner, some people spend a ton of time on their phone, and they're looking at dating apps, and they're trying to move forward like that. The research on that indicates that that's not likely to yield too much fruit. There's a lot of, you can see how for the dating app sites, there's even an incentive to keep people on the app. In other words, if you have people using those apps and they find their man or woman of their dreams to get married, well, presumably they're off the app. And the people that make the app want them on the app as much as possible. And so I think there's a higher probability of finding a husband or wife not online, but in person. So then how do you do that? Well, I think it would be likely a good idea to try to go to groups that are going to be similar to people that you would like to marry. So in other words, I tell all my students that it is a great idea to marry someone who shares your perspective on ultimate questions. So for instance, if you're Catholic, find another Catholic. And the reason for that is that there's inevitably disagreements and conflicts in marriage. It's just the nature of the beast. But if you also, in addition to all the normal things that every married couple will have, in addition to that, you also have a huge faith disagreement. And let's say it's a Catholic and, I don't know, an atheist. And then the person's like, well, I want to baptize the baby. I'm totally opposed to that. And there are no circumstances. I want to celebrate Christmas. Absolutely not. No Christmas. You can imagine, very serious conflicts, especially when children come along. So I think it's a great idea to try to find a spouse, say if you're Catholic, another Catholic to marry. So how do you do that? I would say the most high probability way to do that is to participate in groups of young Catholics, right? So in almost every diocese, I think in the whole country, there are get-togethers, dinners, prayer groups, all kinds of things that are aimed at young Catholics, Catholics out of college, but not yet, married with kids. And so if you're going to those things, presumably you'll meet a bunch of people. And I think too, it's important to keep in mind, if you're meeting people, it may not be that you meet the person of your dreams there, but maybe you meet the sister of the person of your dreams, right? And the sister introduces you, oh, you should meet my brother, my sister, so-and-so. And then all of a sudden you're, in the mix, as it were, with people that would be great fits for you. So that's what I would advise.
Oh, that's good. So a lot of people have this idea of kind of the soulmate argument, that that you have to find this specific person who
Yeah.
fits all of your criterion, and if they're not completely compatible, then you're not open to marriage, maybe open to cohabiting as kind of a temporary solution. But what would your response to be to that position of kind of the soulmate argument, and
Yeah.
especially along the lines of what you're talking about as far as virtue and how marriage itself helps you to mature as a human person?
Yeah. So the research on this is very clear that not so much whether or not the soulmate theory is true, but this, that if you mean by a soulmate someone with whom you have no irreconcilable differences, then the soulmate theory is false. If that's what you mean by a soulmate, because the research shows quite clearly that all married couples have irreconcilable differences. So it could be like the husband likes to get up early in the morning and go to bed early. The wife likes to get out of bed later and go to bed later, right? People just differ in terms of that. It could be political differences. It could be differences in terms of what kind of food they like. It could be, there's a million different things. And so some people have the really bad idea where they say, well, my spouse and I have irreconcilable differences A, B, and C. So I'll go find somebody with whom I share A, B, and C. The trouble with that is, yes, now you found somebody new. They share A, B, and C. But actually D, E, and F, now you disagree with this new person, right? And you could divorce them and look for someone that I share A, B, C, D, E, and F with. Fair enough. But then you have G, H, you have got the rest of the alphabet. So no matter how many people you married, you can marry 10 people, 20 people, you would always find at least some irreconcilable differences. So the difference between a miserable couple or a couple that divorces on the one hand versus a happily married couple is not irreconcilable differences. Happily married couples do still have irreconcilable differences. But the difference is that those couples, despite the differences they have, are able to live together happily and love each other and appreciate each other. And yes, they never agree about what time to get up or what time to go to bed. Okay, that's okay, right? That's just part of finding something that, if you don't, unless you marry yourself, which is not going to be very exciting, I think, you're always going to have some irreconcilable differences with whoever it is you happen to get married to.
Yeah, great point. You talked earlier about how marriage particularly benefits men and women. Can you go dig a little deeper on that, especially, for men, how it helps them to mature, women, how it helps them as well? How does marriage enrich both, the man, the woman, and also their children as a result?
Yeah, marriage is extremely beneficial. And I've already talked a little bit about the financial benefits, but let me talk a little bit about the health benefits. So my wife, I think, literally saved my life one time. I was having an acute appendicitis and I didn't realize it. I just was feeling really bad, but I was planning, I'm not going to go into the hospital, and just was going to stay home. And my wife was like, no, you need to go right away. You look really super sick. So I got there, and thank goodness, my life was saved. And if you look at overall the likelihood of living a healthy life, both in terms of physical health and in terms of mental health, both of those things are much more likely to happen in marriage. And part of the reason is that spouses kind of monitor each other. And what I mean is, if you, find a lesion on your back or whatever that's growing, like, your spouse is likely to be the person that finds that and says, hey, you've got this huge thing on your back. What is that? So you go into the doctor and you get the skin cancer test and, have it removed or whatever. Spouses really help each other to stay more healthy than they otherwise would be. And you see this also through elderly people, right? You've probably heard of this phenomenon where you have a couple that's married, 50 years together. And when one spouse dies, very often the other spouse dies within a year or two. Now, is that just a coincidence? No, I don't think it is. I think part of the reason for that is when both spouses are alive, they're able to look out for each other, right? And say, oh, hey, I noticed that you are having trouble with whatever. Let's get you to the doctor. Or in some cases, someone has a stroke. Well, if your spouse is right there, they can call 911 and get you to the doctor. If you're just sitting there alone, who's going to call 911? So spouses really, really help each other in terms of physical and mental health. And I think that the spousal relationship is helpful not just for the husband and wife, but for their children, for the wider community. This is that's why marriage is so vital for our society.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of questions kind of converging on this issue of making a lifelong commitment, whether it's, to, let's say, the priesthood, the religious life, to marriage, and, a lot of hesitation around that. It seems so risky to make a commitment for life. I think you've shown and made a good case that, in fact, marriage is a much better decision than, example, cohabitating. But, what would you say to the person who's kind of in that place right now? To speak to, this is certainly a big commitment, but at the same time, it's something that's going to help you mature as a human being, teach you to love. Like, what would you say to a person who's at that place?
Yeah, I would say that there's definitely a grain of truth in what they're saying. It obviously is a risky thing. I mean, there's a reason when people get married that they're nervous beforehand. I mean, very few people are just like, hey, I'm totally like not nervous at all. It's a big commitment. But also people should remember that if you say, well, it's risky to get married, sure. Is it risky to not get married, to be single? We just talked today about the risks of cohabitation. Clearly, if that sociological evidence is true, which has, by the way, been replicated over the course of many years, it's not, the research I was appealing to today wasn't like, well, one study once found this. No, this is like many, 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 many different studies replicated over and over again, including very recent studies. So this is not, again, one scholar once found this. No, it's like very well replicated. So cohabitation is very risky. Well, is remaining single risky? Well, if you're thinking about things like health, yeah. If you're thinking about things like, like having a good financial situation, yes. If you're thinking about things like loneliness, yeah. So yes, there's risks in marriage. There's also risks in other things. So you can think about it a little bit like travel. Is there risk in flying? Well, yeah, there's risk in flying. Sometimes, unfortunately, planes crash. Is there risk in driving a car? Yeah, sometimes there's car crashes. Is there risks in walking? As a matter of fact, there are. Some people get hit by a car, they fall, they slip on the ice, whatever. Life is, there's no course. You can say, well, I'm just going to stay in bed, not go anywhere. Oh, that's risky, actually. In fact, it's more likely that you're going to die doing that because your health is going to go absolutely in the toilet and be terrible. So look, yeah, we're on planet Earth and it's a risky place. But marriage as such, I would say, is actually the least risky way to move forward in terms of all these things. The least risky, not the most at all.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we have a question around, some people, they ask, how do we know if we're compatible if we don't live together? It seems like it kind of, there's a huge unknown there. So how would you address that question? Well, how are we going to know if we're compatible if we don't live together?
Yeah. So I guess what I'd say is, if living together were necessary to know whether you're compatible, then what we'd expect to find is people that live together are much less likely to divorce. We don't find that at all. So I'm not saying meet someone and next week get married to them. Don't know them at all. I think you should try to know a potential married partner as much as you can. I don't think to really get to know someone really well, you also need to actually live with them. These are distinct things. So for instance, how would you know whether the person is very tidy or a complete mess, Oscar the Grouch, and totally messy? Well, here's an idea. You don't need to actually move in with them. You could just visit their apartment. And I'm guessing if you visited their apartment, you'd say, oh, this person's super neat. Everything's like put away. Everything's tidy and clean and beautiful. Or it looks like Oscar the Grouch lives here. It's just a pig pen, totally messy, disgusting, and gross. You could look at their car. Again, it might be really neat. It could be a pig pen. So again, I think if it were true that you really get to know someone, you needed to live with them, and then this would in turn lower your likelihood of divorce, the stats would be just the reverse. It would turn out that, if you live with someone, you're 80% less likely to divorce. That's not what the stats show. It shows you're 80% more likely to divorce. So just the opposite. Yeah. So I would definitely encourage people to get to know a potential married partner as well as they can, but not to live together.
Okay. We have a question from Judy asking, is it morally inferior or less mature thing just to prefer being single to being married?
That's a good question. So what I would say is that to be married or to be single is part of a person's personal vocation.
Mm.
So what I mean by personal vocation is if you look at scripture, you see individuals called by God to do certain things. So let's say Moses is called by God to lead the Jewish people out of Egypt into the promised land. Mary of Nazareth is called by God to be the mother of Jesus. St. Paul is called by God to, preach to the Gentiles. So whether you should be married or whether you should be single is a super important question, but there's no single answer for that. So I, Christopher Kaczor, I'm called to be married. Bishop Robert Barron is called not to be married. He's called to be single. So I made the right decision. I answered God's call for me. Bishop Barron made the right decision. He answered God's call for him. So there is no single answer like, well, everyone get married, everyone be single. Well, no, it depends on your personal vocation. And then to discern that, if someone hasn't discerned that yet, what I'd advise is to try to listen to God's call in your everyday normal life. In other words, as you move forward, try to really listen to and really follow God's call in whatever it is you're doing. And then my experience has been that when I do that, things actually do become more clear. It's sort of like if you move towards, imagine you're in a kind of a dark room and there's a little bit of light over there. Well, if you move closer and closer to the light, right, you'll be able to see the light more and more, and you move closer and closer, it gets even brighter. And so I think in a similar way, if we really do follow God's call in our everyday life and we keep moving towards the light, each step, one more step towards the kindly light that's leading us on, we are going to be enlightened and figure out, okay, for me, getting married is my personal vocation. For somebody else, maybe it's to become a Carmelite sister. For somebody else, maybe it's to become a Dominican priest. I mean, God calls different people to different things. So, but I do think the best way to discern that is not to wait for an apparition from the Virgin Mary that says, hey, you need to be a Dominican, you need to be a Carmelite, you need to be, but rather in everyday life. And I think most people know in everyday life what God calls them to. God calls us to pray, right? To make time every day to pray. God calls us to do the works of mercy. God calls us to serve our neighbor. So, I think if we listen to that, and more importantly, not just listen, but actually do that to the best of our ability, we'll move closer and closer to the light and therefore become more and more enlightened about how to move forward.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. You talked a little bit earlier about how we can grow in virtue in order to prepare ourselves for marriage or for whatever vocation we're called to. What would be some advice for somebody who is perhaps dating or considering dating, kind of at that point? What are some questions to ask and things to consider as they discern, who would be somebody that would be a good marriage partner for them?
Yeah. Well, one thing to consider is how would this person be? Would I choose this person to be my own father or my own mother? Because if you choose a spouse, assuming, that you're fertile, you are choosing, in fact, the future father of your kids or the future mother of your kids. So if the person you're thinking about, you think this person would be a terrible father. I would die if this person were my father. They're irresponsible. They drink way too much. They lose their job every other week. They're just terrible. Well, if you get married to this person, have kids with this person, you are making this person the father of your children, and likewise, the mother of your children. So I think that's one factor that could be relevant. The other one would be, it is a good idea, I think, to really listen to people in your life that know you and love you. So if you bring home a boyfriend or girlfriend and your parents are like, oh my word, this person's, got a big spider tattoo on his face and he's into Hell's Angels and you just got out of prison for the 4th time. I don't know, honey, maybe this is not, Mr. Right for you. I mean, I think we do need to listen to those more mature voices that are a little less, have a more objective perspective, you might say.
That's good. So at the other end of the spectrum, let's say we've got some, a friend, a loved one who perhaps has gone through a divorce, or has cohabited and is now out of that relationship. What are some ways that we can support them to help them? Perhaps they're looking to get married eventually. Just as a friend or a family member, how can we accompany those loved ones?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think that whether the issue is divorce situation or cohabiting or whatever, I think we're really called to help everyone, whatever their situation is, to move forward. And how do we do that? Well, I would say the first thing is to be a real friend to the person and to really listen to where they're coming from and listen to their difficulties and their challenges. And real friends, I think they do listen and they're very understanding. But I do think real friends are also encouraging. And they say, you know what? You're in this situation now and things are going to change. You can move forward in a positive way. I want to help you in any way I can to move forward in a positive way. And so sometimes even, words of not just encouragement, like, I trust you. I think you can do this. You're a great person. But also words of, real practical direction can also be helpful, right? So I know in my situation, I've had a number of friends who, talk to me about their situation, and I've shared with them, well, many times when I've been in a situation that's difficult like this, and I've done things that I think, oh man, I shouldn't have done that. It really helps me a lot to go to confession. And so I've had many friends and family members who have gone to confession, and, sometimes I'll go with them and go, hey, we can both go at 4:00 at Saturday, that, church is open. And I do think for many people, that is an enormous release of, their guilt and their feelings of discomfort with what they've done. Because sometimes people are totally innocent victims. That obviously happens too. But sometimes people do recognize in their own lives, like I do, like, wow, gosh, I really shouldn't have done that. I really caused problems for myself and others when I did X, Y, and Z. And I do think that encouraging people to make use of the sacraments, especially confession, is a great way of helping them really get a new start, right? Move forward in a really positive way. And so that's something that I found very helpful for people.
Great advice. Can you just share a little bit more personally about your own vocational discernment? You're a married man, and some of the challenges that you faced, how you made your way through that, discerned your vocation to marriage, you and your wife.
Yeah. So for me, back when I was late high school and college, early college, I actually thought about the priesthood. And I thought, well, God maybe is calling me to be a priest. And basically, I think it was God's providence that showed me, no, that's totally wrong. Because basically, anytime I went for, sometimes young men, they have these kind of come and discern kind of things. And I'd go to them and it'd be like, well, I'll tell you like one story. So I went to this one thing. I won't say the order because it might embarrass people. But I was talking to the vocation director there, and the vocation director said, well, what are your views on things? And I said, well, I accept the church's teaching on X, Y, and Z. And the person goes, oh my gosh, you're a regular Cardinal Ratzinger. And meant this as a kind of an insult. So, but yeah, I had the same views as Pope Benedict XVI. Yeah, that's right. Another time, a different place, I went in there and a person said, well, what attracts you about being a priest? And I said, well, God, I'd love to be able to celebrate Mass for people. I'd love to hear confessions. I just think this, give sermons, the spiritual part of it. And the person goes, well, priests have to do a lot of other things like repave church parking lots and put a new roof on the rectory and this and that. It's like, well, yeah, but I'm not going into construction. That I'm just dying to, repave parking lots or something. Anyway, so everything I said, this person said the opposite. And then at the end, this person said to me, or I said to this person, well, do you see any, how are things going here in terms of vocations? Getting better, worse? And this person looked at me, scowled, and said, as long as Rome demands a celibate male, I see no end to the problem in sight.
Oh, no.
So that didn't go well. But basically, every time I looked into priesthood, it was a similar experience, like the door slamming in my face, door slamming in my face. And when I met my wife, Jennifer, just the opposite of a door slamming in my face. So God, in my case, really led me through his own providential care.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned earlier how, a lot of dioceses have meetups, young adult groups, places where you can meet potential spouses. I know this is something that a lot of people struggle with, is just finding a spouse, especially if you're already out of college. You don't necessarily have that college community. What can we do, if we're a parishioner at our church, or if, we have children who are approaching that age, to help create the conditions, for these young people to find each other? apart from arranged marriages, of course, which
Yeah.
I'm not totally opposed to.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, what are some of the things that we can do, practically speaking, to help create those conditions for young people to meet each other in our parish, for example?
Yeah, I do think when we know people, sometimes we can act as a kind of quasi matchmaker. If you're aware of, hey, my son is 25 and my friend's, daughter's 24 or whatever, and they're both single, and you have a family barbecue, and get the families together, and oh, hey, they happen to be there. I mean, I do think it's nice if they can meet in not a fully, high pressure situation, but if people are open to going on a blind date with someone, I don't see any reason why sometimes that does work out, But I do think there's a lot of social things that can be done to facilitate people meeting each other and introducing, hey, have you met so-and-so? They just graduated from Notre Dame. And hey, yeah, so-and-so. You introduce each other after Mass or whatever, things like that. So I do think that could be a good way to move forward.
Great advice. So we have a question here. Isn't cohabitation only a concern for those who are very religious or traditional? So this applies maybe to those serious Catholics or very traditional people, but this doesn't really apply to me. How does what you say really put the lie to that question?
Yeah, so the research that I shared today is not research done only on quote unquote serious Catholics. This is done just on the general population. So I guess I'd ask someone, do they want to have a lasting, loving marriage? And if they say yes, then it seems to me all the research indicates that if that's what you're looking for, the odds of that happening are much higher if you do not cohabit prior to marriage. So I think the research indicates, again, not that it's specifically or uniquely for any religion, right? It's not singling out Catholics or Jews or Muslims or anybody else. It's just the general population. The research indicates that cohabitation is not a great alternative to marriage. And cohabitation is also not a great preparation for marriage. In fact, it's quite detrimental preparation for marriage. Now, if you get somebody who says, look, I don't care about happiness, I don't care about marriage, I don't care about love. Well, okay, if you're, I think you might need, that seems like a bit different issue. But if you care about happiness, if you care about love, if you care about having a relationship be a good relationship, again, all those things are much more likely to happen within marriage. So I don't think it's distinctly Catholic at all. So it'd be a little bit like you Catholics, you're so hung up, thinking stealing is wrong. Because, Catholics think stealing is wrong. But this is not distinctly or uniquely Catholic thing. I think any person, any reasonable person, can understand stealing is wrong.
Yeah.
Right? It's not a matter of revelation or something. This is everyday common sense, natural reasoning says stealing is wrong. And I think people don't know this, but the research indicates very clearly that, again, if you want a lifelong, happy, faithful, violence-free marriage, the odds of all those things happening are much higher in marriage without cohabitation.
Great. Wonderful. All right. So let's say we've got a couple, two Catholics. They've been cohabitating for, a number of years. They've experienced some conversion, or, they want to get married, but they're living together. Okay. So obviously there's a lot of prudential concerns and things that need to be thought through. But what would be some advice to a couple who's in that situation to help so that they can really prepare to enter into the marriage union fruitfully?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I do think if couples want to enter into a fruitful marriage, then it really would be important to, get a date, talk to the priest, figure things out. And then I do think for a lot of things, things are very particular for, this couple. And so a good priest is, I think, able to judge in this particular situation, like, hey, here's the right way for you to move forward given your circumstances and such. So I think that might be a good step forward.
Great. Wonderful. So we've got a lot of questions circling around. Well, isn't living together just like being married? So can you talk about, and I know we're anticipating a little bit the next seminar, but what is it? What is qualitatively differently? What is different, the difference between marriage and cohabitation? If you just look at it, it looks the same, but what is the qualitative difference there?
Yeah, so it can appear the same. You say, well, look, say you have, a couple that's, together, they're living in the same house. Well, you wouldn't know from the outside necessarily whether they're cohabiting or whether they're married. So yes, in some respects, obviously they're the same. But in another respect, they're very, very different. And what is the difference? Well, the difference is that people are much more likely to carry out their public, active, free commitments in comparison to people that don't have a public, active, and free commitments. So let's imagine just a totally different scenario.
Yeah.
Let's say I say to you, I promise you, I'm never going to smoke cigarettes again. And I promised you, and I promise all my friends and family, I make this big announcement, no more cigarettes. And then you see me later today smoking a cigarette. Well, you would be like, hey, what's going on here? You just made a big announcement, no more cigarettes for you. Here you are smoking again.
Mm-hmm.
So when I make a public active pronouncement, I hereby promise I'm not smoking cigarettes anymore. What that does is provide me a great resource for carrying out those good intentions.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I know, well, if people see me smoking, they're going to call me out. I want to be consistent. And so that's why when people in our society have an important role, we make them take vows. We make them take an oath. So think about a judge, right? If you're going to become a judge, you have to take an oath of office, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to join the military, you take an oath for that office.
Mm-hmm.
And so what marriage is an oath or a vow to love this person in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, for richer, for poor, till death do us part. You're vowing that. You're making an oath. You're making a solemn, public, active promise to do this. Now, does that guarantee that you do it? No, it doesn't guarantee you do it, but it greatly increases the likelihood that you'll do it, right? Just like, again, if you think about people signing contracts, does that guarantee that you'll do the contract? Well, it doesn't guarantee it, but if you don't have a contract at all, that definitely doesn't guarantee it, right? You're more likely to carry it out if you have actively, publicly promised and vowed and taken an oath to uphold the law, to be a good Marine, to be a good husband, be a good wife.
Wonderful. And we have a number of questions. People really intrigued at the statistics that you brought forward today. Can you direct folks to some good websites, resources, places they can go to dig in and learn some of this, especially, let's say they have their kids or people that they know that are kind of on the fence on this. What are some good resources for people?
So I actually have a book called The 7 Big Myths About Marriage. And the book has a whole chapter about cohabitation, and I've just presented kind of the heart of the chapter to you. But if you look in that book, in the footnotes, you'll see extensive footnotes that to all the different scholarly researchers that talk about all these issues. So the book is basically talks about more than just cohabitation, but that's one of the chapters in there. And actually, tomorrow's seminar and the next day's seminar are different chapters from that book, The 7 Big Myths About the Catholic Church. And my wife also in that book has included some really funny, great family stories in there. So people will probably get a kick out of that.
Great. That's wonderful. So we do have a question about, let's say some people are cohabitating and they're maybe not getting very good advice from people within their parish community. Oh, it's okay if you're cohabitated, it's really not that bad. How can people discern, a good community, a good resources that will help, guide them to make decisions based on, good fundamental principles rather than maybe bad advice by those who may lead them astray?
Yeah, I do think sometimes people give advice and they wish the person well, but unless you've studied this sort of background, the advice that you give may not be empirically supported. So in other words, if you are having medical issues, it seems to me it's really wise to go to a doctor, right? If you have legal issues, it's really a great idea to go to a lawyer. But not many people really study the issues that I've been talking about. Not many people are real experts in these issues of cohabitation and the stats and stuff. So I think many people have goodwill and they're trying to do their best, but they may mistakenly be giving people advice that really doesn't have any empirical support. So I think it's important to try to find good resources that really are empirically supported to move forward with this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Any closing words for us, just as far as, let's say, people have heard this talk, they're convinced, they're on board with this. Can you give us some practical steps for folks to put this into action, whether it's, sharing this with someone they know, or taking it and bringing it into their parish community. Any advice that you would give to people?
Yeah, I think it is possible to share resources like this with others. And there's lots of other people that are doing similar research about issues of marriage. I want to highlight in particular a professor at the University of Virginia named Brad Wilcox, who has books and stuff on Twitter and all kinds of stuff that is directly relevant to these issues of marriage. So there's a lot of very good resources out there, a lot of really good information. And I do think you can really do a service to people and really help them by helping them understand these issues better, and hopefully helping them to move forward armed with accurate information. Because I do think a lot of people labor under really misinformation.
Yeah.
And they think in their mind, well, I can't get married. I'll just be doomed to divorce unless I wait to get married till I'm 35. And so therefore, I guess I got to cohabit before. But again, that kind of myth, that kind of misinformation, oh, I'll get divorced if I get married anytime before 35, is just totally unsupported empirically. Your likelihood of getting divorced, as I said, goes up after age 32, not down.
Yeah.
So, I try to help my students to know the facts and the reality about these issues. And obviously it's a free country. People are going to decide, what they're going to do. But I think it's just a shame when people are laboring under misinformation and false facts, and then they're deciding based on just these myths. So that's why I really enjoy talking about these issues.
Well, to be continued. We've got 2 more days coming up. Thank you, Dr. Kaczor.
Thank you.
For those of you who are watching on the Word on Fire Institute platform, we will see you again tomorrow and Wednesday as we continue our conversation. For those of you joining us on YouTube, I hope you will go to institute.wordonfire.org right now to sign up to become an Institute member. You can sign up for a 30-day free trial, catch all of the seminars we've already done, explore our online courses, and join one of our many online communities. Come join us in conversation. I hope to see you there. We'll be back here tomorrow, right here in Rochester. We'll see you then, and God bless you.